Hello, viewers. I'm glad you're here. Today, let's talk about the history of soju and also how to make it. So there are so many fun facts to learn about today. So soju is Korea's most famous alcohol. So let's try to answer these questions. What is the origin of distilled alcohol? And then, what is the origin of soju, and how has soju changed over time? And then I want to ask the question, what is traditional soju? And can you make traditional soju yourself? So those are the questions I want to cover today. My main source of information for this video is this book, Soju, A Global History by Hyunhee Park. So I'm going to be showing you excerpts from this book as we go through this discussion. I haven't really talked about soju on this channel, and that's because I've been fermenting alcohol. I've been making fermented rice wine on this channel, not distilled alcohol. So the idea of distillation is to heat a liquid and condense its vapor in order to concentrate certain components of the liquid. So that's the idea. Many ancient civilizations knew about distillation, but they used it for other things. They used it for perfume or for mercury or maybe for distilling salt water into fresh water. So they had the idea of distillation, but they did not apply it to alcohol. We don't really know who distilled alcohol first, but it could have been independently invented in multiple places. It does seem that Europe learned about distilled alcohol from the Muslim scientific world in the medieval era. For example, the word alcohol comes from Arabic. The first thing I want to show you from the book is this map. Middle Eastern distilled spirits are often called arak. And so take a look at this map to see how the word arak spread around the world. So before there was soju, there was arak that arrived in Asia via trade. And also there were Chinese distilleries in the Song and Jin dynasties just before the Yuan dynasty. And the Chinese distilled alcohol was called shaozhou, or cooked wine. So shaozhou is the origin of the Korean word soju. So that's just the origin of the word, but how did soju originate in Korea? Where did it really come from? In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire invaded Korea, which at that time was called Goryeo. And let's look at this map from the book. Eventually, the Goryeo rulers surrendered to the Mongol Empire, but were allowed to exist as a vassal state. And the Mongol Empire conquered China as well, establishing the Yuan dynasty. So following this period of war was a period of relative peace, and the parts of the Mongol Empire covered most of Asia, and there were many opportunities for cultural exchange. The point of talking about this is that the Mongols transferred technology and the culture of distillation to Korea, especially in that their soldiers brought portable stills to Korea. So Mongols made an alcoholic drink from fermented mare's milk that could only last a short time, and they distilled this drink into a much stronger alcohol that could be kept for a long time. And this alcohol was important culturally to the Mongols. So here's an example of a Mongolian still, a portable still. So this is the kind of still that the Mongol army could easily bring into Korea when they invaded. And that's one of the main points of this book, that even though Goryeo Korea encountered foreign arak and shaozhou through gifts and trade earlier, it wasn't until the Mongols brought their technology and drinking culture to Goryeo that soju could become part of Korean culture. And another point is that it wasn't just a simple transfer of products. Koreans did not drink the Mongol mare's milk drinks, but they adapted the idea to the ingredients they did have, such as rice or millet. So that happened in the Goryeo era in Korea. But there's actually much more documentation of soju in the Joseon era. And there were recipes for soju written down. For example, this one. I think this is interesting. This is a multi-stage recipe. The first stage does not involve any yeast or nuruk, just souring. So this recipe is not what I would do today, but I have seen recipes like this before where you make something and let it go sour as the first stage. Prior to distilling, this is simply a fermented rice wine. So here's an interesting fact. Soju was produced by ordinary families in Joseon, Korea. So in the production of distilled alcohol, there's an interesting contrast between Korea and China. Specifically, the Joseon government did not encourage large-scale distilleries. They expected the households to be able to distill alcohol for royal needs. Whereas in China, there were large-scale distilleries. So what kinds of stills did they use in this time period? So stills were generally bronze or pottery. And we can see a diagram here of different kinds of stills. So early Joseon, probably they used what's called here protomorphic stills. That's the Mongol-style stills, which would be enclosed, and there would be a small cup that would collect the distillate inside a larger jar. The more advanced form of still is called Chinese style here, which has a tube allowing the distilled alcohol to flow out. And this is the soju gori. So I've seen an example of a pottery soju gori before. Here it is.
This one is Korean traditional distilled thing. We call it the soju gori.
And Koreans do use this style of still now, this kind of pot still with the tube. And during the Joseon period, soju became a part of homebrewing culture, the Gaeyangju culture, homebrewed alcohol. And soju was used for medicine and ritual purposes. And by the late Joseon, there's evidence that many ordinary households had soju gori and were able to make soju. And we can see this in this document's discussion of alcohol bans, trying to regulate the private production of soju in Korea. I think it's interesting that this document specifically says that takju does not have to be banned because it can be taken as a substitute for a meal and is helpful for those who travel on the road. Now let's move on to the Japanese occupation period, 1910 to 1945. So the Liquor Tax Act enacted by the Japanese banned homebrewing and distilling, and so it undermined the Korean culture of home production of alcohol. And this was the beginning of industrial soju. The industrial soju uses industrial scale stills that produce almost pure ethanol from cheap materials. Then it would be diluted and various things would be added to it. That's the modern form of industrial soju, which is the most common form of soju you can get even now. So many of these large-scale factories were built in Korea, and this is the dramatic change of Korean soju from a crafted product to an industrial one. And also as a matter of terminology, the Japanese wrote soju this way instead of this way, the original Chinese way. However, both of these forms are pronounced soju in Korean. Even after the end of the Japanese occupation and the end of the Korean War, it was still difficult to go back to the old ways of making soju. So even in the 1960s, South Korea had an improving economy, but there were grain shortages, and there was a government act banning the making of alcoholic beverages using grains. So that completely suppressed the traditional distillation methods. So obviously, if you can't make soju using grains, then you're forced to continue making industrial soju with sweet potatoes or other non-grain starches. So what happened is that traditional soju distilleries completely disappeared in the 1970s. And soju became very popular, but it was the industrial soju that was popular. And there was a revival of traditional soju starting in the 1980s. And again, this was government-led. Government decided to promote traditional alcohol or national folk liquor. So they did put some effort into promoting national folk liquor, but this revival was not particularly historically accurate. So, for example, is modern Andong soju the traditional Goryeo soju? Well, almost certainly not, but the historic association is good marketing. Another misstep in the revival of traditional soju in the 1980s was that they used, instead of using the Chinese characters, the original Chinese characters for soju, they used the characters that the Japanese used. So that's awkward and obviously historically wrong if you want to emphasize the Korean folk liquor traditions, that you would use the older characters, not the characters that were used during the time of the Japanese occupation. And here's another trend. You might know this already, but industrial soju producers have been lowering the alcohol content of their products over the years. I'm pretty sure that the original distilled soju was 40% alcohol or more. But in the 1970s, industrial soju was 30% alcohol. In the 2000s, 20%. And by 2009, it had been lowered to 16.5%. And I checked the alcohol content of current flavored soju products, and those are around 13%. What is traditional soju? Answering the question, what is traditional soju? Well, soju is not a static thing. Koreans adapted it to their homemade alcohol traditions. And soju came from somewhere, and it's going somewhere else. So answering the question, what is traditional soju, is a value judgment about what is meaningful to you about soju production and consumption. These days, Andong soju is the top example of traditional soju. It's the most famous, despite the historical inaccuracies that I mentioned earlier. But in my judgment, what are some meaningful aspects of traditional soju? Well, one aspect is that it's made from grain. You ferment grain and distill it. I think that's an important aspect of traditional soju. And of course, rice falls in that category. And also that it has a relatively high alcohol content. And some of the newer industrial products, really the alcohol content is so low, it overlaps with the alcohol content of yakju, chongju, for example. So that overlap makes it less distinct. So I think the higher alcohol content of traditional soju is an important aspect. And you can ask more questions. Does traditional soju have to be distilled in a Mongolian style still or a soju gori? But I can see that this would be very difficult to scale. So I suspect that except for very specialized products, it would be difficult to produce large quantities of traditional soju in the oldest kinds of stills. There would have to be some upgrading of the technology for larger stills. The household style, small scale stills, I can't see how any company now could really have a product using the actual traditional technology. So obviously things do have to evolve and change over time, but that's what I think is most important about traditional soju. Just that it should be made with grain, and it should be relatively high alcohol content, definitely more than 30%. That I think that's important. So the big question now, can you make traditional soju yourself? Well, today we've learned that ordinary Joseon people certainly made soju at home. And I know that we can make rice wine at home in our kitchen, that rice wine is certainly suitable for distillation. But I think this is a big topic, and I'm out of time, so I'll have to discuss this more in the next episode. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching.